Or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Josh from Business Review Webinars, and I will be your host. It is our pleasure to have Nucleus Network with us today, who will be presenting the webinar entitled Fast Track Your Phase 1 Clinical Trial. Now, a little bit about Nucleus Network. They are the world's only multi-site, multi-country Phase 1 trial specialist, with units in both Australia and the USA. And over the past 17 plus years, they have conducted over 1,000 Phase 1 trials, and over 50% of their trials are annually are true first-in-human. Your speakers today are Dr. Graham Wood, Executive VP in the USA, and Biljana Georgijevska, Director of Clinical Development, who is based in Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. And in order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into that box at the top right-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have had. And please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But for now, please allow me to welcome Graham.
Well, thank you very much. Really what we want to cover today is looking at the three different jurisdictions, so the US, Canada, and Australia, and see how they differ in when you're running your first-in-human or your Phase 1 clinical trial. And really the two main things we want you to get from this is there's differences in the timelines you're going to see between the jurisdictions, as well as the regulatory feedback. And when you're selecting it, you kind of need to pick what's right for you, for your particular program, or just for you as the company if you have just one single program going forward. So what are we going to cover today? So Biljana is going to go into a bit of detail about kind of how the Phase 1 market is being globalized. I mean, personally, I think a great example is looked at the attendee list, and there's actually 33 countries represented today. And the other thing is, if you listen, you're going to hear three very different accents from myself, the host, as well as Biljana. So definitely the Phase 1 market has become really global. The studies are moving around, so you need to be able to take advantage of that. The next is the global pharmaceutical market size. So where the most money being made in terms of the most sales of pharmaceuticals. Then we're going to dive into trying to understand what are the differences between the FDA, between Health Canada and TGA in terms of what they require to get your first-in-human study started. And then how do those requirements, how do they translate into timeline differences? We'll do a little bit of a deep dive into that. Then some key benefits and challenges for the different jurisdictions. I mean, there's some parts, one country may be better and the other is not as good, so we'll review those a bit. And then one of the big things near the end will be looking at what's the benefit of getting regulatory feedback from the USA. And then last but not least is looking at a kind of a bespoke approach where you can kind of get the best of both worlds when it comes to starting your first-in-human clinical trial. So Biljana, I'll pass it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Graham. So to jump right into it, so the Phase 1 clinical trial market is truly global. So with sponsors looking or selecting both domestic and offshore locations to conduct their clinical trials. And usually the location selection is based off a number of factors that we'll touch on during today's webinar. So kind of just to start off, in summary, in 2020, there were approximately 3,200 industry-funded Phase 1 clinical trials that were conducted, and 34% of those were actually delivered outside of the sponsor's home country or offshored. So trials conducted by sponsors in a country other than their home country. You'll see, based on the slide, the particular table, that both the US and Australia are the top two destinations for offshore trials. And specifically, if we kind of So we have the USA that's leading the way, and then we look at Australia. And so the total number of phase 1 trials that were hosted in 2020 or conducted in 2020 were 151. And we'll see that 52 of those, or a third of those, were actually offshored from the US. So that is quite impressive. The global drug development market definitely is experiencing a rapid growth as the pace of pharmaceutical innovation continues to increase. And ultimately, this growth is driven by the demand for new therapies, which ultimately will see both the pharmaceutical and biotech companies increasing their global R&D spend. And this increase is forecasted to reach around 30% through to 2026. So ultimately, the drive for new therapies, the increased spend in identifying new therapies ultimately translates in accelerating the growth in the preclinical drug pipeline. And then ultimately that translates into the phase 1 trials. So the phase 1 trial market by 2026 is projected to reach approximately 4,100 phase 1 trials. In terms of where sponsors select to conduct their trials or to place their trials, usually what they look at, and this has become quite common, is they look at the requirements for the market in which the drug is intended to be sold. And that's how they engage with the requirements of that region and the regulatory framework that they need to adhere to. So to select, I guess, what sponsors also look at, or when they're selecting a particular location, they do look at two main factors, and really it's around the characteristics of the trial's destination country and the characteristics of the trial provider. And ultimately, the key decisions or the key criteria that they take in consideration does include the expected trial quality, the speed, the population availability, the capacity, and the cost of the trial. And during today's webinar, we'll delve into kind of these aspects across the three countries in a bit more detail. So I will hand over to Graham.
So to go into a bit of what do the different countries require, and really, I think the important thing to understand is at the base, in terms of the preclinical and non-clinical program you need to do, it is exactly the same between the three countries. All three countries are part of ICH. So US and Canada are members, and Australia are observers to ICH. So when you're going into your first in human, I mean, you're going to be following either ICH, the M3, or the S6, depending it's a small or large molecule. But those preclinical studies, the package really is going to be the same. Really what comes down to is how are you presenting that to the regulators? So in Canada and the US, you end up, you provide actually a lot more details in your applications, as well as you're actually even summarizing it in kind of multiple different ways. So really that core I refer to is that investigator brochure, so where you're describing the preclinical studies you've done, all the pharmacology you've done, all those types of things in your IB. It's going to be the same between the three. Again, your protocol is going to be your same. Your informed consent will be the same. In terms of where you need to be on your preclinical program, you need to have your summaries from all your studies, because that's the data that you're filling into your IB. The one thing we do note on the table is for Australia, you use those summary reports to make your IB, but you don't have to submit them. For Australia, the submissions really are those three at the top. So IB, the protocol, and informed consent form. Then when things start getting quite different and it really kind of changes your timelines as well as your expense, which we'll review a bit later, is when things like in the FDA, you need to have your non-clinical, you have to have your final reports, and they are put into your IND. You need to have send data sets for your submission to the US as well. Again, as we'll see, this is something that takes time to put together. All your CMC documentation, you'll need that for either your IND or your CTA. And then one thing you'll notice here is the clinical trial notification. I mean, Bill, I think you're better at describing that than I am.
Yeah, definitely. So in Australia, the regulatory framework, unlike the US and Canada, the TGA, or the Therapeutics Good Administration, doesn't review and approve our applications. Rather, the review and approval is done by an ethics committee or an IRB or ATREC. And from a regulatory perspective, once the trial is ready to commence, it is an online form called the CTN that is completed, and then that is submitted to the TGA, and basically that is just to notify them that there is a plan to conduct a phase 1 trial of an unapproved therapeutic good at a specific phase 1 clinical unit. So very different from the kind of the US and Canada. In Australia, it's more just of a notification. And something maybe to kind of highlight is that in terms of kind of your preclinical package or your non-clinical data, that is the same across the board. So coming to Australia doesn't necessarily mean kind of eliminating the need for certain preclinical, testing. All of that is the same across the board and in line with ICH GCP. Really the main difference is just around the regulatory body, and that it's just a notification and not a request for approval.
All right, thank you, Billiana. And then, so last row on there is based in US and Canada, you're compiling everything together. In the US, you put it into your IND. And Canada, you put it into your CTA. Slight difference, a 30-day approval, or I guess review period, I would say. The difference is in US, you just wait for hearing nothing back. In Canada, you're waiting for your NOL, or your no objection letter. And then once you have those, then you can get going. One thing to point out is we talk about when you have your NOL or your CTA, the approval, that you can start your studies. What we are referring to, though, is starting to screen for your studies. And it's the same in Australia, as you're waiting for when the notification's gone in, you're waiting to be able to start screening. So your dosing is obviously going to be a little bit further out, depending on your screening window. So what are, some other key features? One to call out here is for your CTA in Canada, you are allowed to submit it in French. So, looking at the countries of people attending, for some that could actually might be a benefit. So it may make things just a little bit easier. The other thing is regulatory review as well as ethics review can happen at the same time. I've seen this, this can help speed things up, but it also can come out of a bit of a risk, because if either your IRB or the regulatory agency asks for a change, then you need to, so say the IRB asks you to change something, then you need to go back to the regulatory. So it can save time, but comes out of a little bit of a risk. So we see a lot of sponsors end up just waiting and doing regulatory and then IRB. In terms of registration, actually for clinicaltrials.gov, a lot of companies are putting their phase 1 studies on there, but it's actually the phase 1 studies are one of the type of studies that are exempt, so it's not required. But Billiana, I believe there is a registration required for Australia.
Yeah, that is correct. So that can either be done on clinicaltrials.gov or the ANZ CTR, which is a platform that is used in Australia and New Zealand, and it captures the trials that are conducted within that specific region.
Okay, and then in terms of in-country presence, you do need it for all three. It is a bit, I always say, very different between them. So U.S. and Canada, it's really finding a local agent who can submit on your behalf. Canada does have some tax credits, but you do need to I guess you do need to be local to get them. You don't have to have revenue, but you do have to have a local office. But probably the one that differs the most, and I will throw it back to Biljana to describe, will be Australia.
Yes, so definitely. So with Australia, there are some financial incentives if a sponsor comes to Australia and conducts their clinical trials. So that's the R&D tax incentive. It's a scheme that's been set up by the Australian government. And in fact, just really quick to kind of add is that we recently, we partnered or collaborated with Amplia Therapeutics, and this specific biotech company were able to receive a refund or a tax refund of approximately $1.14 million. So that definitely makes a big difference, especially for biotech companies. But overall, it is that in Australia, your companies are required to have local representation, and in order to take advantage of the tax credits or the financial incentives that we do offer, companies are required to set up a local subsidiary, and there's definitely avenues for support to provide to companies of how to achieve that. But definitely that is an appealing aspect.
I mean, I can speak from experience. In a past life working at a biotech, we looked into setting up the subsidiary. It is fairly, I mean, there's obviously paperwork and stuff involved, but it's not something that there's a lot of companies that can really help with it and make it pretty easy. So it's not as a daunting process as it may sound.
Yeah, it's a well-worn path, I would say. Oh, sorry, I was just going to add that it is a well-worn path in Australia. So definitely there is that support.
Yep. And last but not least, the specimen export allowed. I mean, this question comes up a lot. So yeah, if you do need to ship your samples, your bioanalytical lab, where you're doing your biomarkers are outside these jurisdictions, shipping your samples out is not a problem at all. And I mean, it can happen. I mean, I've seen samples come, I mean, within 2 days from Australia. I mean, obviously Canada, US, I mean, overnight is no problem at all. Okay, so in terms of timelines, I'll talk a bit about FDA and Health Canada, and Biljana gets the easier, shorter one.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, I mean, first thing with having worked, I mean, with many sponsors, been on the biotech side, going through the regulatory process, both for Health Canada and the FDA, what we're presenting here are kind of averages, actually, and some of these are a bit on the, I guess, the faster side. The end of the day, what actually becomes your rate limiting step really depends on your program. I've seen CMC documentation for, I mean, sometimes people don't have a formulation yet. So, I mean, really your drug's substance, but you don't have details on your drug product much yet because you're doing an oral solution, or say just a simple tablet, very much faster than if you're doing, like, obviously, like a sterile IV. The documentation needed is very different. So we tried to present an example, but obviously each program is fairly unique in what can become your rate limiting. At the end of the day, though, there's a lot more documentation that's required for the FDA and for Health Canada. So, I mean, I've already talked about the CMC. You do need for both. Your non-clinical summary reports generally aren't your rate limiting, but again, it depends. At the last second, you may have had to have done some new tox study, and that could become rate limiting. But big difference with the FDA versus Health Canada is you do need those final reports, so you do need the time to finalize them, and then. While all this is ongoing, you can be preparing your CTA, you can be preparing your IND, but you are going to have to, when you do have those final reports, kind of finalize everything, put it all together. Another big thing, and this can be very time consuming, is the SEND data sets required for the FDA. So I've seen a few companies out there publish saying that they can do it within 8 weeks. I've seen programs that are 3 months long to put in your send data sets. And again, it kind of comes down to the risk you want. If you want to build your send data sets without QA data, you can save time. But obviously, if something changes, then you're going to have to update your send data set. So there's always that kind of risk, kind of benefit you need to weigh as you're putting this together, trying to find ways to squeeze. And obviously, you can see from the timelines for FDA and for Health Canada, it's definitely quite a bit longer than what you get for Australia. So I will throw it over to you, Brianna, to describe the Australian process.
Great. So just to add from an Australian perspective, really the driver behind kind of the shorter timelines is that there isn't that need for the Therapeutics and Good Administration, or the TGA, to approve the trial. So ultimately, the starting point is the preparation for the ATRIC or the IRB submission. So it's preparing your investigator brochure, preparing the protocol, the participant-informed consent. And those are, I would say, the essential documents, among some others, that form part of the ATRIC submission package. And usually the kind of that period for preparation, we account for around 4 or so weeks. Obviously, clients can prepare well in advance, but usually that's kind of the framework we work around. And then that application is submitted to the ethics committee, and that review process, it is around the 4 to 5 weeks until we receive approval. And you'll see that there's a big difference, I would say, between the FDA, Canada and Australia from that perspective. So in the US and Canada, once you have your tick of approval from the regulatory agency, the IRB review and approval is fairly quickly within a week. Whereas in Australia, that in-depth review really falls with the ethics committee. And so that's kind of the driver behind the timeline difference between kind of the US, Canada and Australia. So once we get ethics approval, or we get that tick of approval from the ethics committee, we then submit the CTN to notify the TGA that we're going to proceed with the phase 1 trial. So overall, we're looking at a 10-week timeline, or actually from submission to approval to kind of commencing the studies at 6 weeks. So ethics submission 4 weeks, and getting that tick of approval for all, notifying the TGA, all of that comes together around 6 weeks before we can commence with a trial in Australia. So it is a fairly quick process, which is, we see that clients find that very appealing. But again, when you come to Australia, we need to make sure that all of the preclinical or your tox package is complete, as that will feed into the preparation for the documentation.
Yes, I mean, here it's definitely quite a bit faster in Australia. The other thing we tried to quantify a bit is the the cost differential. So the extra documentation needed, some companies, if you have the internal teams, this is coming from your internal hours. If you're a small virtual biotech and you're outsourcing it, it's going to come at an actual cost to you. So other important thing is these, finalizing your preclinical reports, your send data sets, these are savings that you're going to get to be able to start your first in human without these costs if you go to Australia. But obviously, if you ever want to get a CTA, get an IND, these costs are going to hit you. It's just the timing of when they hit. If you go to Australia, you're actually delaying when these have to get done. So you're putting the cost off. It's not an actual complete savings. It's just the timing of when the expense will hit for you. And a lot of companies, that can be a huge difference. So I think that segues quite nicely into this is the speed as well as that lower cost can come at quite a big benefit. So there's a lot of, starting kind of on the left side, a lot of companies, being able to say that either they've started their first in human study or saying they've completed it and hopefully everything is gone to what you expected, that can be a significant milestone. Sometimes there's actual, you've already out-licensed the product and there's milestones payments on that. A public company, it's a fantastic press release. that can help drive interest in your stock. So there's a lot of good benefits to companies, small and large, to be able to say that the programs have got off running or finished that much sooner. Obviously, the sooner you start, hopefully the sooner you end your program as well. So when that revenue can start hitting, to improve your net present value, because that revenue will hit sooner, can be a big benefit. And it depends if you're looking at a 10-year plus program to get to approval, a few months, not tons, but definitely if you've got a shorter timeline for approval, those few months, half year can have a decent sized difference. The third, we always hate talking about this, but drugs, they don't all make it through. That's why we do the testing to see which ones are working. It could be the pharmacokinetics. It's just not being absorbed. It could be the PD measures you were hoping to see change just aren't even budging, or it could be a safety signal. But finding this out sooner, it helps you save money in the long run. The team that's working on it, just the financial burn for extra 6 months of their effort is definitely big impact. So it's good to know soon. And then last is if you're the first of a new target, new mechanism, that first mover advantage, it does come at a decent benefit. So if you can find a way to get on the market that much faster, it definitely can help you along in the process. So what are some other, I guess, key attributes to look at? So U.S., we've talked about it, is the largest pharmaceutical market in the world. We have some slides a bit later on of how that actually can benefit you. One important thing is really the standard of care between these three jurisdictions is incredibly similar. Obviously, for a first-in-human study where it's generally healthy normals, it doesn't matter as much. But when you start talking in patients, I think it's important that the standard of care is quite similar, so that what the patients entering the studies, their treatment options are going to be quite similar between the three jurisdictions. So it won't be that different. In terms of some of the challenges, both the U.S. and Canada, depending on where you pick, you might need your ICF in more than one language. So English and French in Canada, and English and Spanish in the U.S. Again, it's very regional. Some of the other things I'd focus on are, say, like the demographic diversity. Obviously, we want our clinical trials to be as diverse as possible to really represent the entire population. When you look at the actual country level, U.S. is definitely more diverse than, I think, Canada, Australia. However, when you look at the major cities, the places where the phase 1 clinical trial units are, actually that's where the diversity becomes quite similar. Even to the extent in Australia, ethno bridging studies become possible because of large Asian populations. So there is some nice advantages there as well. So in terms of, we've talked a bit about this, you want to get feedback from the regulators. And we've talked about, the U.S. is the biggest market in the world, and why do you want to get their feedback early on? These bullets, and this is actually pulled directly from an actually FDA guidance. So this is when the FDA is talking about the different type of meetings. So those, so your pre-IND meeting or like your end of phase 2 meetings, what are the benefits of it? And I think they're clearly supporting what we're saying, is that there are some big benefits for getting their feedback. So they can help you avoid some unnecessary studies. You may think you need a drug-drug interaction study, but FDA doesn't. So right there, you're saving money. Really gaining the FDA support on your overall development strategy. Are you focusing on the right things? To provide that exchange of ideas. It's a lot of biotech, you're always pulling in different consultants, getting different points of view. Why not get the point of view from the regulator, the people who are going to be making the decision? It's a great way to get that feedback. Definitely minimizing costs. I mean, like I said before, making sure you're doing the right studies and the endpoints of those studies. I mean, this is a huge part of the feedback, really making sure that what you're focusing on in the endpoint is what's going to help get you approval within, I mean, in this case, within the FGA or whatever other jurisdiction you're in. So it really is important having those interactions. And I mean, even they put in negotiation with the FDA. Again, that's not us, that's them acknowledging the fact that there is going to be some negotiation. Truth is, I mean, who knows the molecule best is the company that has developed it. And making sure the FDA understands the intricacies early on definitely comes at a big benefit. So then, does this mean that once you start in Australia, you're gonna stick there, or you start in Canada, you're not necessarily gonna stick there? And definitely no. And like I said before, it really depends. As at a biotech, we had a program pushing forward in Canada. We had a program pushing forward in the US, and we approached Australia to have a benefit from the speed aspect, push forward a program there as well. So it's not, even for a given company, you can try different pathways for different molecules, really depending on your needs. We have at Nucleus a number of clients who come to us and ask for to look at the different pathways to see what is best, and then maybe decide not to go to Australia, but go to the US or vice versa. So really, it's good to engage early on, understand what your benefits are going to be. Important thing in terms of starting in Australia, coming to the US, if you remember back in the slide Biljana presented on the globalization, literally 1/3 of studies being run in Australia right now are US companies. So I can guarantee you, after starting in Australia, they did come then bring it back to the US. So that's one thing that we can offer at Nucleus is that fast startup in Australia. And then literally all that, I mean, remember when we presented the timeline, there's all those weeks while you've got to get everything ready for the FDA. Well, if you've started in Australia, while you're getting everything ready for your IND, you can be running your first in human study. So that the way it ends up is your first in human study is ending pretty much when you're ready to submit your IND for either your later phase 1 or your phase 2 studies that you want to go. So the timing can work really, really nice. So that the program is still moving forward while you're doing those phase 1 studies in Australia. So I guess from there we are ready for some questions. So I think some have been submitted. Okay, so the first one I see, Biljana, is in light of the current pandemic, are there any changes to the current regulatory pathways?
In terms of kind of the standard pathway or the ethics pathway, there hasn't been any changes, either from a regulatory perspective or from a HREC review timeline. I would say the main change that we've seen is that specifically for our COVID trials, so whether it's for vaccines or any therapeutics, the ethics committees have actually created an expedited pathway. So they go through their own separate pathway where you can see approval received for those types of trials in approximately the 2-week mark from submission. So that, I would say, that's primarily the main change. So everything really remains the same. It's only specifically related to the COVID trials where we've seen
For Health Canada and for the FDA, it's I mean it's a similar aspect. So if it is a COVID treatment or prevention, so I mean in the US it's the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, and it can help you save time. In terms of just your non-COVID stuff, then it is kind of, as of now, it's everything is the same.
Yeah, I can have a look at some other questions. Let me quickly see here. What do we have? So are there any differences between the content of the preclinical packages required between each country? I think we touched on this during the presentation. I don't know, Graham, if you want to maybe add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important one to highlight. I think you alluded to this in the presentation, is people kind of equate speed with cutting corners, but that's not the case. In terms of your preclinical packages, the expectations, obviously, I mean, one could require something slightly different, but I mean, at the base, it's all following ICH, so the expectations should be really similar. So you're not, it's really how you're documenting those studies, reporting those studies that are different. It's not the actual studies you have to do between the different jurisdictions. So here's an interesting one, is how mature is the Australian clinical trial market compared to US or Canada?
Yes, so I would say in Australia, so we've been running trials for the last 2 decades. So in terms of experience, that is, I would say over the last 2 decades, we have gained a lot of experience, maybe not as mature as the US and Canada, but definitely, I would say definitely a well-worn path, and there's a lot of expertise within Australia, specifically around the conduct of clinical trials that definitely gets leveraged by clientele that come in country, and obviously infrastructure also.
Yeah, I mean, to add, having worked in the U.S.-Canada market for over 22 years now, I mean, I think it's been around a little bit longer. But I mean, Australians been doing it for 20 years. Everything I've seen is the way it's operating in Australia is very, very similar to US and Canada. So I don't think you're going to see differences in terms of infrastructure, in terms of quality. I think all jurisdictions have been, FDA goes to Australia, goes to Canada, like same with EMA. So I don't think, even though it's slightly newer in Australia, you're not going to notice a difference in terms of what you're going to see at the sites.
And that, I would say, maybe addresses another question I see here, just specifically around the data. I would say this is quite a common question that we do receive from clients that are inquiring about bringing trials, I would say specifically to Australia. So will the data from all these countries be accepted for an IND, NDA? And is it acceptable everywhere?
Yeah.
Maybe if you want to weigh in, Graham, I'm happy to kind of add to that.
Yes, even the FDA has a guidance on accepting data from other countries, and I mean, when you go through the guide, really the focus is, were they done under GCP, which, I mean, as it's an ICH country, definitely Australia is 100% under GCP, and we kind of alluded to one other thing people look for is the diversity. Is there a similar in diversity, which there definitely is. Okay, looks like we have another question. I think this is actually a good one for you to answer, Biljana, is with so much of Australia in lockdown, can you still recruit for trials effectively?
Okay, so this is a great question, Graham, on the eve of specifically Victoria coming out of lockdown. So can we effectively recruit to our trials? So just maybe quickly to add in here is that Nucleus Network was identified as an essential service, and really throughout the lockdown we have been open, so we have been conducting trials successfully. In terms of recruitment, I would say I think the impact of COVID, specifically related to recruitment, has been felt, I would say, across the globe, but specifically in Australia. Really what we've had to do is, our borders are closed. So really what that meant for us is to look at different strategies around how to recruit participants. So yes, we've continued to recruit, but the strategies that we employ to recruit participants, I would say, are fairly different to what we used to do. And really, something that will be quite beneficial is that we do have a webinar specifically around recruitment that we'll be holding next month. So happy to kind of provide some details to all the listeners today on this webinar with a link to that specific webinar, where we'll delve into a bit more detail just in regards to how we recruit during this period and what are the strategies that we've employed to successfully fill our trials. Okay.
Are there any last questions?
Yep. So I see a question here. Last question. And this is really just around if running trials between Australia and the US. So if I was running a trial with Nucleus or NN in Australia and the US, is there a cost or other benefit to me?
Yeah, I mean, I can take this one. So there definitely are cost as well as, I guess, kind of ease of use type benefits. So, I mean, cost, I mean, we are one company. So in terms of looking at volume discounts, we definitely offer companies that, I mean, run everything in one versus everything in other, or as well as companies that run across both locations. We definitely can give those cost benefits. In terms of, like, as you're referring to the ease of use, you start your first in-human program in Australia and then move to the US. I mean, like a number of our sponsors have done recently. One of the nice things is that there's a lot of crosstalk between our sites. We do have, obviously, a time difference, but pretty much on a weekly basis. And we're not talking just like executive. We're talking also at the level of our principal investigators, our pharmacists, I mean, some of our clinic supervisors. So what it allows us is the transfer of knowledge from what was going on in Australia for that first in human over to, say, our pharmacist, how to prepare the drug. That's all happening internally. Versus if you're switching to a different clinical site, then it's kind of on the sponsor's responsibility to help transfer that knowledge. So there's definitely some savings there in terms of the sponsor, how quickly or how much time they have to spend to get the US team up to speed on all that. Because you learn fantastic information about the molecule, what to expect when you're giving it. So we do that transfer for you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you to Graham and Biljana for what was a fantastic presentation, and to Nucleus Network for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this and where you can access this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. And we look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so just keep an eye out on the website just mentioned. Thank you everyone for tuning in once again, and we will hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.